Hello, BookTube. I have a tag for you today. This is Wednesday, and on Tuesday, the guys at Stripcover Lit have been making tags every week, and they've always been great. And there was one last night. They always happen too late on Tuesday for me to get to on Tuesday. Usually I have fun and I romp all around and I play with the bean and I talk to you and I do all sorts of things while the sun is in the sky. And then usually by the evening, once the evening is full on, my guilty conscience has kicked in and I'm starting to get to work, so I don't tend to make videos then. And you might think, well, sure you do, because you upload your videos very, very late, so you must be making them late. And no, no, if you look at the light level in the videos, you'll see that I make them much earlier and just forget to upload them. I really need to get this BookTube thing down. but I wanted to do the tag today. Dalton Gentry made it, and he also started his video, as he does these videos, the last few, with a hint, a slight intimation that maybe he was going to stop doing these Tuesday tags. Steve has already said how much Steve likes these tags, so they must continue indefinitely. but this one's a really good one. It's a really good one, and it's like 15 minutes after it came out, there were like 16 people who had already done it. So I'm actually coming late to this tag, even though it's the next day. It's the Jumbo Genre Recommendations tag, and it's all about book recommendations. And the first, it's just 12 genres. And the idea is actually the idea moves a little over the map. But Dalton's original phrasing is you've got somebody who's coming to reading cold, they haven't read in a long time, maybe they haven't read anything in the genre that you're talking about. Well, how do you make a recommendation to them? What is it that you recommend to them? But Dalton's answers sometimes wavered to another part of the spectrum with that, and I've noticed that the same thing is true. Mark Richardson of Richardson Reads and David Murphy both did this tag, and they both also wavered a bit. And the wavering is very understandable. I worked as a bookstore clerk forever and ever, for 25 years. And a large part of what I did during the day was to recommend books. And long before that, I was recommending books in print, in newspapers. And long since then, I am recommending books in print, in newspapers. And now on this channel, a large chunk of my life has been devoted to recommending books, and it's an extremely delicate process. There's nothing worse than a bad book recommendation. You will not only harm your standing with that other person, but you might harm their willingness to read. It's an incredibly sacred trust. And when you are recommending books to someone, especially if the someone is brand new in some way or other, either new to reading or just getting back to reading or new to the subject matter that you're recommending, there's two things that you must not blur together. You must not wander from one to the other, because the first one is the first thing that Dalton alludes to, which is, I want to give you a recommendation that is the right entry point for where you are in the genre that we're talking about. That is the book that you should read. The other part of the spectrum is a great book from that genre. Not a book you should read, but a book you should have read. And it's not good. It is counterproductive to recommend the second kind to someone who's in the first bracket. That, if that makes any sense. Like, for instance, when one of the genres here is fantasy, and when Dalton gets to fantasy, he wastes no time at all. In recommending The Lord of the Rings. That is a very bad recommendation for the first group of person. A person who's never read any fantasy before should not read Lord of the Rings to start with. It's 3 volumes long. A recommendation has to encourage a person. It has to assure them that they can do it, because the person is in totally new territory. So you can't recommend The Lord of the Rings. You also, in terms, I mean, I love it. I absolutely love it. But, like, you can't recommend Anna Karenina either for fiction, for Pete's sake. Yes, you're saying Anna Karenina is a novel that you absolutely have to read once you're reading novels. Absolutely. It is one of the greatest novels ever written. But we're talking about someone who's coming to reading. You can't hand them Anna Karenina. That would be a bad recommendation. They won't do it, and they'll feel bad about not doing it. So I always had to go through this arithmetic myself when I was at the bookstore and someone would come in and say, I'm looking for a book. I need a recommendation. I would always tell them. They would come to my information desk where they knew where to find me. And there were always people behind them in line. And I would, I had a standard response. When somebody would say, I need a recommendation on such and such a subject, I would say, okay, hold on a second. I'm going to drag in a young, talentless non-entity to stand here and help these customers behind you. You and I are going to go off into a corner and have a little physical exam. And these people, these customers, especially, they never met me before. They were, ooh, but they always came back. They always came back. Then when you have them aside, you ask them key questions. Tell me the last few books you really enjoyed. Tell me some of your favorite books. Not necessarily because I'm going to find like to like, but because I'm going to know from that list of favorite books what things about reading, regardless of genre, get you going. And I will match those things rather than if you like this, then you'll like this. If you like this, then you like this is extremely blind. It's an extremely blunt process. What I want to know is if you felt this, okay, then I will go to other books that will make you feel that. And I would also, take a sort of a tour of the horizon of what they know and don't know and what their experience is and whatnot. So on one level, the jumbo genre recommendation tag is a little tough. Because even with a beginner person, even someone who's saying, I'm coming to this raw, I would still ask all those questions. There isn't really, in most cases, a completely universal entrance point book that you can just give to anybody. That is almost not possible to do. And I don't think I encounter it many times in this tag. But we'll see what we can get to. We're just going to go through the genres just like everybody else. It brings back memories, though, is what I'm trying to say, is that this tag brings back memories. Because once upon a time, that's all I did all day. It was absolutely useless for 20-something managers to officiously tell me what NCAP needed breaking down or redoing. It was absolutely useless for 20-something managers to tell me that there was a spill of water from the water bubbler in the break room, and could I go and clean it up? I remember in like 1990 or something like that, the first manager who said that to me, I said, something wrong with you? You noticed it? And you walked right by it to come and tell somebody else to clean it up because it's not commensurate with your dignity? Go up and clean it up before somebody slips on it. It was useless for managers to do that. Usually what I did was stand at the information desk during the lunch rush from noon to 2 and just talk books that whole time, recommend books, make sure I didn't do it to help the bottom line of the company, but if a customer came up to me with one book, they were going to leave with 5. And the rest of the time I wandered around the store finding people and asking them, poking my nose into their business and asking them questions. So this brings back memories, because this is a lot of what I did. But, I mean, honestly, you get a question of what novel you're going to recommend to someone who's maybe leery or hasn't read a lot of novels, and your recommendation is Moving On by Larry McMurtry. It's 800 pages long. I mean, honestly, it's a great novel, but what are you thinking? Anyway, let's see if I can do any better, or maybe worse. So, number 1 is science fiction. And for science fiction, you want something short. For all of these, you want something short. You don't ever want to hand somebody who's new to reading. If they're not new to reading, if they're experienced, you can hand them a big book. But otherwise, no. First thing is, it has to be approachable. It has to be not intimidating. A recommendation is designed to pull somebody in. So it can't be a reflection of you. It's got to be a reflection of them. You can get to you later on once you've got them hooked. But for science fiction, you want something short, immensely readable, and thrilling. And I picked Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. It's a little trite, but it won't fail. I've hardly known anybody for it to fail with. Somebody wants science fiction, they're going to get all the trappings of science fiction, but it's not Fire Upon the Deep by Vernon Finch or something like this, where you've got to be more experienced at science fiction to even get it. And it's also not antiquated. It was intentionally written not to antiquate. So, something like The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester would definitely be on the other part of the spectrum, something you should have read, a classic. But it is a little dated. It is a little strange to read in the present day. So I'm going to go with Ender's Game. And then number 2 is fantasy, because Dalton loves to think of the artificial distinction between science fiction and fantasy. I myself don't think there is one, but they're certainly separate sections usually in stores. So fantasy, you want to pick something short, something very fantasy-esque. You don't want any kind of steampunk or anything like that, and that enchants. And it can't be Lord of the Rings. As Adrian and Dalton themselves covered in their own read-along of the Fellowship of the Ring, a large part of the Fellowship of the Ring is people walking around in the wilderness. The language is very nice, but I maintain the language gets better as it goes along, very intentionally on Tolkien's part. So, but I did come up with a couple of examples, shorter books that are very high fantasy and that will work. The first one is The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany, which is 100 and something years old, but is perfectly done. Just perfectly done. Once you get used to the diction, which doesn't take more than a page or two, you will love it. But also The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. Another perfect example of a fantasy book that will really hook the reader. It's not book 12 in a 10,000 book series. It's not 800 pages long. It doesn't have any kinds of, these things don't have any kinds of the gratuitous violence or sadomasochism that exists in so much fantasy today. Instead, you just get a wonderful, enchanting story. So I'll go with either one of those. Then the third category is mystery. And I'm going to go here with Georges Simenon, the Maigret novels. They're each 100 pages long. They're wonderfully atmospheric. They're deeply plot-driven. But the plot is very artfully revealed in gradual stages so that you are involved in it the whole time. The Simenon novels don't have any of the maddening... I mean, they're maddening. They can also be endearing, but only once you've read a lot of them. At first time, somebody's never done it before. The mannerisms of something like Hercule Poirot or something like that, or Peter Wimsey, I think would be off-putting. You don't want mannerisms like that until you're already accustomed to murder mysteries. So somebody comes to you and says, I've never read a murder mystery before, and I'd like to know what all the fuss is about. Well, the mannerisms, the high art, the high personality, the weird idiosyncrasies comes from Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot and Lord Peter Wimsey and all these characters, all these crime solvers who do it as much by personality as by the little grey cells. They're all descendants of Holmes, and that is one kind of murder mystery. But at the time that Holmes was popular, people were also lining up around the block to read other murder mysteries that were far more mechanistic, and they are the antecedents of things like police procedurals like Ed McBain or Robert Parker, and that I think is a better entrance point for someone who's never read it before, and it doesn't get any better than the Maigret novels, because you get a sense of his personality, but it doesn't overwhelm the story. You get a sense of his world beautifully. The world of mid-century Paris is just beautifully done. You get a little color, the ongoing, wry comic riffs with Mrs. Maigret, and you get an ingeniously devised murder mystery in every single book, and there are hundreds of them, or thousands of them maybe. So I'm going to go with that. Any one of them. It doesn't matter. I know for a fact that it doesn't matter because I've been reading the new Penguin is putting out all of the Maigret novels in new, lovely trade paperback editions with new translations, and I've been reading those out of order. There is no order. I've been reading those just happenstance, and so I know for a fact that it doesn't matter where you enter. Then we have YA, and YA is tough, especially modern YA. Modern YA has a couple of problems for most readers. One is that it's incredibly explicit. I don't know if it's just crept up on us all, or maybe a lot of you are so young that you don't realize it, but it's incredibly explicit, modern YA. It's also incredibly vulgar, just amazingly vulgar, in your face, every paragraph vulgar. And that's going to put off somebody who's brand new to the genre. They're going to come to it and think, okay, this isn't what I thought. I'm not signed up for this. This is gross. And you want to kind of avoid that. If you're reading modern YA, it's not really avoidable. But I came up with a couple of possibilities. They don't succeed in eluding those. One of them is by Becky Albertalli, who's been the subject of veneration and a little bit of backbiting here on BookTube and everywhere else. I understand that. She invites it in her writing. But I want to pick Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda, which was made into a fairly formulaic feel-good movie starring a 40-year-old tobacco addict. But the novel, the original novel itself, is quite touching in parts and quite inventive and kind of funny. I wish that the author had gone through the manuscript once with an actual flesh and blood teenager next to her to maybe say, well, you're not going to drop an F-bomb to your teacher or something like that. But even so, the book I think is charming. And there's another one that I want to mention here, and it's by, I really am recommending an author, and it's Tommy Wallach, Wallach. The book I have that I jotted down here is We All Looked Up, which is about teenagers facing the end of the world, an asteroid coming to destroy the world. And it has some of the things that I'm talking about. It has, incredible violence. It has gratuitous profanity. But it's also very touchingly done, and all of his books are. He's a YA novelist to note. and maybe to find, so that if this one doesn't appeal, maybe another one will. But the point is, someone who hasn't read any YA would read either one of these books and see not only what is attractive about YA, but what is different about it from other genres. These two books that I mentioned, I could name 100 others, are very much YA novels. They are not adult novels masquerading as YA novels or anything else, or fantasy series where the author was just told by an agent or whatever, young up these characters and make this YA. You know, these are very definitely that mind frame. One, a normal story, a relationship story, an angst story, a wary story, and the other, an outsized, end of the world story. Then we'll move on to horror. I have two suggestions with horror. They are both very much the same suggestion, because horror is Dracula. I hate to say that because it sounds like I'm dismissing the whole of a genre, and I'm not. A lot of creativity has gone into the horror genre, but horror is Dracula. Unfortunately, it is true. The chilling, insidious other who gradually comes upon you. And because horror is Dracula, I have a feeling that as this tag goes out and about the way that strip cover lit tags do, they become viral. I have a feeling that 80 million people are going to answer this question with Stephen King. They might. I think Mark at Riches and Reads mentioned Salem's Lot. And Salem's Lot is one of the only actual Stephen King books that's actually kind of sort of good. It was edited, first of all. It was revised, second of all. And it draws deeply, as Mark mentions in his video, it draws deeply on the atmosphere of New England, of small-town New England. And it's a vampire story. It is Dracula. So it's bearable, but I can't stand how the inevitability that Stephen King is going to show up on this tag everywhere like a rash. I'm going to recommend other vampire books. Now, the one I'm going to recommend is, I believe, out of print, and that's a shame. It's by two authors named Skip and Spectre, and it's called The Light at the End. And it's an urban vampire story, but very, very good. Very, very good. Very grippingly written. And the other one that I want to recommend is more modern. It's The Strain. It's volume 1 of The Strain by Chuck Hogan. The book has Guillermo del Toro's name, big as life, on the cover, but I don't think Guillermo del Toro had much to do with the writing of the book. And it's about a modern-day infestation of vampires. It's basically a zombie story, only with vampires. And it's tremendously gripping. Oh my God, you'll keep reading. You'll keep reading. And it's page-turning in the kind of spine-tingling way that I think the best horror is meant to be. Horror novels, horror movies don't frighten me at all. They never have. It's kind of, something's missing in my reading imagination to that effect. So I don't get that part of it. The whole reading but the covers up, and you don't read at night because any noise in the house will make you frightened. I've never understood anything like that. I don't really understand it. I haven't ever understood it. I had an old friend probably 50 years ago. We were drinking and we were talking about literature, and I mentioned this, that horror movies and horror novels don't do it for me at all. And I wondered why. I specifically used that example. I said, when I'm reading a horror novel late at night and I hear a sound in the house, I don't suddenly jump and become frightened. And he said, well, you're reading your horror novel late at night on a bed full of dogs who would know if something was in the house. If they're not reacting, you're not going to react. And that's always been the way. You've always hung out with beings who have super senses, so you know not to be frightened. And he also pointed out that nighttime is a strange time for people to be reading. He said another reason it's not going to work on you is because you read all night long. Most people sleep all night long, so it seems like an odd time for them to be up and about, and sounds are given a greater import. So I'm going to recommend The Strain. The Light at the End I do recommend. I don't know if you can find it at your used bookstore, but The Strain, it was a TV show, so it probably, for all I know, it still is a TV show. So it will probably have a paperback in your bookstore, and the first one is really, really good. But I do have a recommendation for horror that is not Dracula. It is basically Dracula. I think all horror is Dracula, but it's a short story called Sand Kings, and it's by George R.R. Martin, the author of the Game of Thrones, back when he was edited and back when he actually wrote. Back when he wrote prose. He doesn't write prose anymore, and he's never going to again. But back then he did, and he wrote a humdinger collection of short stories. Some of his short stories are amazingly good. Night Flyers is an incredible science fiction short story. It is basically Dracula, but still. But Sand Kings is about a man who he buys sort of a terrarium of these weird-looking insect-like creatures, and his idea is that he will just watch them build their little sand kingdoms, and as just kind of a goldfish bowl or something like that. And it evolves from there. It's amazingly good. So I'll recommend that too, although I don't know what kind of availability you have for Sand Kings. I have no idea. In fact, the fact that I would recommend Sand Kings and the fact that I would also recommend short stories for most of these answers underscores my approach to this with a lot of customers back when I was a book clerk, which was to recommend anthologies. Anthologies can be golden because you can skip from one to the other, and your entry point, your key, is going to be in a good anthology somewhere, and then you have all the others to explore. But anyway, let's move on to fiction. Okay, fiction. This is a tough one. I'm not going to recommend an 800-page novel, either by a dead Russian or by a living Texan. I'm not going to recommend anything that's 800 pages long. For God's sake. Instead, as good as they are, when I was working in a bookstore, I had a fiction recommendation, historical fiction, but still, that was so surefire that I actually told customers that if you buy this book and you don't like it, I'll buy it back from you. Bring it back to the store, and I'll buy it back from you. And no one ever took me up on it. And it's The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. It's a historical novel about the Battle of Gettysburg, and I had been told forever and ever by people, you have to read this book, and I just put it off. Until one time I was at a beach house, and it was one of the only books there. I read through the books that I brought, and I read it, and it was every bit as good as advertised. It's amazing, and it works. I've never had anyone start that book and say, well, it wasn't all that good. So that would be it's the closest thing I have anywhere on this list to a universal recommendation. Although fiction has so many shards to it. Oh my. But anyway, the next category is travel. I have a feeling that a name that comes up in answer to this is going to be Bill Bryson, and that's actually a very good name. That's a very good recommendation. He's a good, solid, inviting writer for travel writing. There's a lot of travel writing that's much better. Bill Bryson would be the first person to tell you that. Patrick Lee Former. All of his books are fantastic, but you don't hand them to somebody new. You don't do it. They're too steep. But another person that I wanted to recommend, in addition to Bill Bryson, Andy Bill Bryson for travel writing, is Red O'Hanlon, who does exotic travel writing, and he's considerably funnier than Bill Bryson, and also he's a better wordsmith. It's better on the page, his books. And he has, I don't know if he writes books anymore. It might be another case where I'm saying, gee, he seems awful lazy, and what I'm just going to say in the comments field, he's been dead for 10 years. It could very well be. You people age so quickly. But if you can find his books, they've been reprinted, some of them, they might still be around, and they're very, very good. Redmond O'Hanlon is very, very good. Number 8 is humor. Once again, I want to recommend a book that I believe is out of print and will stay out of print forever. The old Premiere magazine had a movie review column called If You Ask Me by Libby Waxman-Gelmer. Libby Waxman-Gelmer was a pen name. But it didn't stop Libby Waxman-Gelmer from creating an entire world. Her husband, her children, all that. And she did review movies, but in a very, very aphoristic way. Her columns are screamingly funny. And they were made, If You Ask Me was collected in a book called If You Ask Me. That book is, I'm sure, out of print, but worth the time to find. The only problem would be that it's about movies from the 1980s, so you'd have to watch those movies first to really get the full effect. But oh my God, for instance, her review of Field of Dreams, and a bunch of others. But I also want to recommend somebody who is still in print. I'm sure that a favorite response here will be David Sedaris, whose little books of comedic sketches are very effective. They sell like buckets. They sell like hotcakes. And, I've read them all, and I understand why. They're very approachable. That might do as a beginning of humor. I would also recommend any cartoon collection by Roz Chast, the great cartoonist from The New Yorker. I would recommend her, definitely. It's not written prose, but it doesn't matter. They're so wonderful that she had to be on the list. Then the next one is history, which is admittedly difficult. I think Eric Larson will probably be a number one pick here, and that's understandable, because again, he writes approachable, interesting, popular histories, so you can pick him up and read him. Or I think Mark mentioned How the Irish Saved Civilization, another one that's it's not dumb, but it is very much entry level. It won't intimidate the newcomer to history, which is, they're the readers who are going to be most likely to be intimidated. History is unfairly characterized, I think, as a very intimidating genre. I always like, alternate to those people, that kind of book, I always like a history book that is both inviting in terms of its readability, but also really, really good, where you're not sacrificing depth for approachability. I like those. They're much harder to find, but fortunately, there is an author who seems to be able to write nothing else. I'm talking about Stacy Schiff, and I would recommend The Witches by Stacy Schiff, her book about the Salem witch trials. Give it to anybody. If you hand a paperback like that to somebody who's never read a book of history in their life, they're not going to put it down, because it's so glowingly readable. I mean, her book about Cleopatra is the same way, but Cleopatra, you've got the extra disadvantage of ancient history working against that, whereas the Salem witch trials feels more recent. So I would recommend that, The Witches by Stacy Schiff. Just a surefire hit. No halfway decent reader is going to put that down. And then the next category is biography. Oh, I'm sorry. Dalton didn't include a biography category in this genre recommendations tag. My favorite genre was left out. So we'll just skip right over that. We'll go to Science and Nature. Science and Nature is next. And they're all... The Science and Nature is a really good one for luring someone in, because you've got writers like David Quammen. You've got big picture books, whether they're old or new. I think David Murphy held up Carl Sagan's Cosmos. Perfect example. And a bunch of others, too. There's a bunch of other things you could do. Books on infectious diseases or anything like that. And they keep coming out. So Science and Nature is actually an easy one. I used to be happy when a customer would come up to me and ask for that, because it's a fairly easy thing to do. And the one I want to recommend is new. It's Cal Newport's book, Digital Minimalism, in which he diagnoses that we are all too digital and then lays out why that's bad and how to correct it. I don't agree with a lot of his central tenets at all. I think the thing that's missing from digital overload that he talks about is self-control. a quality in human beings that disappeared in the 21st century, but that's not my fault. It's still a good quality. I think the digital world is extremely easy to get the most out of with the least amount of negativity if you exercise self-control. If you don't exercise self-control, then of course it will be bad for you, just like not exercising self-control anywhere else would be bad for you. And it's the one thing that's missing from his book. But Digital Minimalism is really good. It's a really good book, and it's very thought-provoking, and it's written in a very inviting style. And it'll be in your library. It's a brand new book. So that'll get my vote. Then number 11 was craft. Dalton centered this right away on the craft of writing, and the words craft of writing were barely out of his mouth before he started mentioning Stephen frickin' King again. Stephen King's lousy book on writing that all that book will do, it's a self-entitled, self-impressed, self-quoting, self-regarding in a mirror, cranky old grandfather yelling at you for the course of the book. There's no good instruction in it, and if you follow what little precepts there are in those pages, the most it's guaranteed to do is make you a writer as bad as Stephen King. And yet it is the go-to writing book for an entire generation, and that just breaks my heart. It breaks my little artificial rhesus monkey heart. I don't have a book on writing prose to recommend. Writing prose just in general is purely a matter of trial and error. You just have to do it enormously in great heaping buckets. And then over time, which cannot be shortened, you will learn what works and doesn't work, what you can and cannot do, where the fun is. And maybe later, if you're lucky, you'll learn what your voice is. And once you have your voice, you're gold. So I'm not going to do fiction, because I've never yet encountered a book. I mean, I love John Gardner. I love his books on fiction, but they end up being... I end up loving them mainly for his musings on certain books, or certain types of books. I don't think there's anywhere in any of the books he's written on writing any good precepts on writing. You develop your own precepts on writing, and you do it by doing it. But in terms of specified genres, you can at least have a craft book that is a meditation on what they are and aren't, what they do and don't do. And for that, I want to recommend yet again Glenn Maxwell's book on poetry, which is a few years old now, but still in print, I believe, still out and available in bookstores, and is tremendous on every page. Just tremendous. Even if you don't ever think about writing poetry, even if you don't think about reading poetry, even if you're interested in something else, in prose, just the observations that he brings to bear on every page will be worth your time. It's an incredible book. And then category number 12 is a dark horse, something that doesn't quite fit with the others. And naturally, one of the first things that came to my mind is a big collection of New Yorker cartoons. I'm a huge fan of New Yorker cartoons. They were the original emojis. They are amazing. And they cover everything. They cover every single intricacy of life, if you just pay enough attention to them. And they're also a history lesson. By now, they're a history lesson. The New Yorker cartoons from the 1940s are a history lesson. To those of you who were born 20 years ago, they would be eye-opening in a way. So an old New Yorker cartoon, if you're at a yard sale or a flea market or something like that, and you encounter one of those big old New Yorker cartoons collections, just get one and page through it and see what you think. You'll find, I think, that some cartoons that are 60 years old still have the power to make you laugh. So that's one thing. There's another odd thing that I wanted to mention here. It's small. I think it's still in print. It's really interesting and very funny, but it won't be for everybody. So maybe it doesn't belong on a recommendations list. It's called Ken's Guide to the Bible. It's like 100 pages long, and it breaks down the Bible with little synopses and little visual images to sort of categorize the kind of thing you're reading. And it's incendiary and hilarious, just hilarious. It's for pound for me on a book that small. It's one of the funniest books that I regularly return to. So if you maybe if you're devoutly religious, you probably wouldn't want to read it. But if you're not, it's a hoot. And that's it. That is the jumbo genre recommendation tag. Missing a few genres, but still a terrific strip cover lit tag. Yet another in a long string of terrific strip cover lit tags. And all it's left for me to do is tag people. I have a list of people I want to tag here. I want to tag Joe, the retired book nerd. I want to tag Olive at a Book Olive. All these people who have big bookshelves behind them and have been reading their whole lives, they're going to have recommendations and thoughts about recommending books. I want to hear it all. I tag David, the Poptimist. I'll try to remember to leave a link to all my tag people so that they know they're being tagged. But I'd love to hear what he has to say. Then let's see here. Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse. Kelly at Books I'm Not Reading. I'd love to hear your recommendations of things. Jason, I think, works in a bookstore, or did for a long time. So he would have encountered these problems. What do you do when somebody comes up to you and says, I'm looking for a recommendation? You have to ask a whole bunch of follow-up questions. I'd love to hear about it. Jay Shay. I haven't tagged Jay Shay in a long time. So by all means, you've got a room full of books. Do this tag. Jess at Garden Scriptorium. Somebody who's been a teacher forever will know all about recommending books. You also have a wall of books behind you. There's got to be recommendation stories there. And that does it. Oh yes, of course. Britta. I tagged Britta. We were just Skyping the other day and she was saying, I have so many tags I want to do. So I tag her as well. And that's it. That is the Strip Cover Lit Tuesday tag, which is going to go on forever. Thank you, BookTube.